It's still February when I'm filming this program. It's probably not February when you're watching it, because I believe it's about February 23rd, the filming of this program, okay? Black History Month. You know, I've never, ever, been a fan of Black History Month because, and I never really thought about it. How about this till just this minute, okay? Coming up as a young person, I remember even from the 8th grade when I was wearing a black beret to junior high school and a black jacket. I didn't have a leather jacket at the time. It was one of those black jackets my dad had sent me from Vietnam. I think even military kids would know what those jackets are. The one with the country of Vietnam on the back, maybe have your name on the front. Well, we had those too. So I would come to school, to junior high school, looking like a Black Panther, okay? With maybe a white turtleneck and sunglasses and a switchblade in my pocket. That was the best I could do in the 8th grade, And my thing, it was like my heroes were the Black Panthers. And also like Angela Davis and Huey P. Newton. I had the picture on my bedroom wall of him in that wicker chair, I think most of us know that picture and all. And Angela Davis. These were the pictures on my wall. And I was never, ever a fan of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because to me, he was a brother that simply took a punch, okay? Now, of course, this time, as I was in junior high school, this was after Martin Luther King had been assassinated, okay? So it was the history. I was into the history, and I was studying history, black history, and I just didn't have any respect for Martin Luther King Jr. because he didn't fight back. And I remember even one day I went to my father. My father's from the Bronx, New York, was in the military, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, E9, highest echelon of the enlisted ranks and all. A very wise man. And I came to him, because I was concerned, troubled why everybody liked Martin Luther King Jr. And I didn't. And I shared with him, and he knew my heroes because all I used to do was walk in my bedroom. They were on my walls. And he explained to me that without one, they couldn't have had the other. Now, I respected my dad. And I don't think I even quite understood what he was talking about. But that was enough to satisfy me in that he gave me an answer. And it didn't look like he was making it up. He looked like he knew what he was talking about. I just didn't quite get it, okay? But that was sufficient, And so I believe that through the years, me not really embracing Black History Month, because Black History Month was created in the 70s, I believe, while I was in school. And so it was like the same old folks. George Washington Carver, Frederick Douglass, probably Harriet Tubman, and Thurgood Marshall, and the same old crew. And those were, my heroes were Stokely Carmichael, Black Power, and those other brothers, the Ruff Brothers, Malcolm X, those are my heroes. I had a quote on the wall in my bedroom at the time from George Jackson, the guy that Angela Davis allegedly tried to break out of prison. My heroes. And so I was never a fan, of Black History Month. But I did understand. I wasn't against it. I was just never a fan of it, even to this day. And so what I started doing maybe a couple of years ago on Facebook was sort of posting pictures of civil rights, people who are involved in the civil rights movement that most folks didn't know about. And some of them were not black. Some of them were Asian, like Grace Lee Boggs. Have you ever heard of her? Google Grace Lee Boggs, okay? And so there were a lot of folks. If you look even at the picture when Malcolm X was killed and they were kneeling down by him while he's laying on the ground dying, his head is rested on another Chinese woman's lap, So there were other people involved in the civil rights movement that they don't get much play. So I tried to include those for the past couple of years on Facebook every day. But what I started doing this year, I started including my own ancestors. We got my mother's back to the early 1800s, my mother's back to the late 1700s, my dad's back into the early 1800s and all. And I began posting pictures of Facebook of them because I believe that we can have misunderstandings of the people that were functioning, the black people that were functioning, you know, even in the 1800s or so, simply based on the movies that we see and the inferences, you know, that people give us that they really don't even know what they're talking about, you know. And so I began to share, you know, my great-great-grandfather, who was freed from slavery, of course, in 1865 or so, but began working for the State Department in 1866 until he was in his 90s. Okay, and I didn't even address his employment initially. I just put a picture of him standing with one of his granddaughters, and then I posted a picture of my grandfather standing with his daughter, and then I put a picture of my father standing with my sister, his daughter, and a picture of me standing with my daughter. And I was simply making the point that, you know, certain positive family traits are passed down generationally. But then I got to begin to receive compliments on my great-great-grandfather standing with his granddaughter and saying, they're dressed up, what, were they going to church? And that's why I came back and had to express to them where this man worked. And these were not his church clothes, okay? And then my grandfather as well, wearing a little derby and a nice little suit and everything. These were not his church clothes. These were his clothes, okay? But see, we have these feelings that, you know, that black people in those in the 1800s, the late 1800s and the early 1900s were somehow second-class citizens, and they may have had issues. But many of them were gainfully employed, and those were my relatives as well. So I had to make sure they understood. And as well as I began to post, and I knew these people, you know, from my family tree. I began to post like my great-grandmother. It was a white Irish lady from the Isle of Man. She had come to America in like 1883 or so and married my great-grandfather in... I can't even remember the dates. But the point is, these were immigrants, white immigrants, coming to America and marrying black folks, okay? The movies don't really depict exactly what was going on at that time, okay? And so I was just trying to use my ancestry to sort of eliminate some of the stereotypes and the myths that both whites and blacks have about the life of black folks, you know, in America at that time. Now I have to admit that my dad's family, well, his great-great-grandfather that worked for the State Department, of course, that was in Washington, D.C., but then the rest of his family that were living somewhat successful lives were coming up in New York and in Harlem, in a place where black folks could flourish, okay? I began to also share my mother's side of the family, my mother's lineage, my mother whose father was Mexican. He'd come up, you know, illegally from Mexico. What was interesting was he was 26 years old and she was, I think, 13 when they got married. Different times, right? And a very interesting anecdote about her was that he died, I think he was about 42 or so when he died of tuberculosis or something. And then now my grandmother, she had my mother and maybe 7 other kids or so, maybe 6 other kids. They were being fruitful and multiplying. And this was a black woman that had been married to a Mexican that had kids, and when he died, although she nor her kids had ever been to Mexico, they tried to deport her to Mexico. So she ended up marrying a black man, a black American man, and that settled that case, you know. So she had like a total of like 15 kids, half of them from the Mexican, half of them from the black man, you know. Very interesting. But I said all of that, you know, basically getting back to my feeling about Black History Month. I was never really a fan of it, okay? And then I became a fan of Black History Month just this year, 2023, as I began sharing the black history of my family. And I think that would be a good thing for black folks to do. Stop looking at, you know, all of Thurgood Marshall, Harry. I mean, come on, that's spent. I mean, come on, we all know about those folks. Let's go get into some real black history. Black history that we know is not fictitious. Black history that can't be, you know, overblown or even underblown. The black history of our own family. I think that would be quite enlightening, quite good. Fortunately for me, though, My brother had done a lot of all of the genealogy research for our family a few years back, where he had flown to other cities, checking birth certificates, death certificates, grave sites, and I mean he's got he compiled a book and presented it as a gift to each one of us. So all thanks to Brian, I wouldn't even have known a lot of the stuff that I did know. Like one of my mother's cousins was a Tuskegee Airman, one of those flyers. Who would have known that? You'd be surprised as you begin to check your own black history. One of my uncles, my mother's brother, and he's still alive today, Uncle Frank. He was a teacher in Chicago. Well, let me go a little bit further back, give you a little bit of insight in this, how unfair situations were for black people. And which is why black folks, we have to then and we have to now walk with our eyes open, look for stuff, be aware. Because there are things being hidden from you. So after high school, which is probably in the 30s for this guy, he was probably born in like 1920, 30s or early 40s or whatever, he was going to be a hobo. And a hobo wasn't all like a homeless guy today. A hobo was almost like romanticized, just travel around the trains and all this stuff. He was hoboing around after high school, came to this one city, and he bumped into this white guy that he went to school with growing up. And this white kid was as poor as they were. But this white had a job, had a suit on, was going to work. My uncle was like, how do you get a job like this? And the guy said, well, I went to college. My uncle, college? How'd you go to college? You didn't have any money like we didn't have any money. The guy said, college is free. I know it's not free today, but it was free then. He told him how my uncle got his stuff together, went back home, went to college, graduated, became a teacher, and guess what? He was teaching ninth grade gifted students at a particular time in Chicago. And guess who was in one of his classes? Michelle Obama. She's always been smart, by the way. That was just a little side note. But as you've been researching your family tree, you find out things like this. It can be really amazing to you, man. That will energize Black History Month for you. Begin analyzing your own Black history. Beginning back to Martin Luther King Jr. So I was talking to his brother the other day, and he was kind of ragging on Martin Luther King Jr., I mean, I did enough ragging on him back in the day. But he was ragging on him. He was calling him like a communist and a troublemaker. Now this brother's a Republican Trump supporter. But I love talking. We just have a difference in opinion about politics and social situations and all. So we always have very lively debates, But so he was ragging on Martin Luther King as a communist and a troublemaker. So hold on a minute. I said, let's separate that. Okay, you say he's a communist. Why do you think he's a communist? Well, because, he was thinking about everything needed to be equal and blah, blah, blah. Going over that same old, the line, right? And my response to him was, in a situation such as that, a situation such as what black folks were facing at the time, what was wrong with communism? Because, because communism, he said, well, that would just take what everybody has and just pass them out and make them equal. Well, if you're oppressing a people and you have more and you're oppressing a people that have less, I don't think the people that have less can be dissed for wanting things to be equal. So if there is an oppressor that is oppressing people and keeping them down, I don't see anything wrong with the concept or the ideology of communism if it means that everybody gets the same thing. So we want to vilify a particular political belief, but go to the people that are suffering the most and ask them what they think. And so we had a very lively conversation because we ended up talking about, Fidel Castro, and we were talking about all the black folks. And so as we were talking about Martin Luther King Jr., I'm like, okay, we talked about, and he had to admit that if you're in a situation of being totally oppressed, and these people that are oppressing you have way more than you and they're keeping you under, there's nothing wrong with the concept of communism. Now the problem is that we haven't really witnessed a pure communism, because every time somebody gets in charge, they want to cut off more for themselves. That's not communism, okay? But again, you don't have pure democracy either. So there's no pure anything when you get human beings involved, because you got this greed thing going on that prevents any of these mechanisms for functioning as they are written, in the book and all. And so then I asked, well, how was he a troublemaker? And he really couldn't come up with anything. And he was just scraping. And there was nothing there. First of all, he wasn't a communist. But I just said, so what if he was? So that was that. And then, so was he a troublemaker? How? What was he doing? Okay, so he had a lot of disparaging things to say about Martin Luther King Jr., but none of them really were valid. And I was expressing to him, my feeling toward like Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X and some of those rough brothers, Huey P. Newton, Angela Davis, some of those other folks on the other side over there. And he was saying, well, Malcolm, they just didn't want to, they wanted to shut him down because they knew they couldn't have a war and fight the U.S. government. That's false. The only reason the United States truly embraced Martin Luther King Jr. the way they did, and even tried to pass some bills or whatever for him, was because they were concerned about an uprising within the United States of America. Because you had veterans that had gone off to World War II, like my dad, and come back. You had veterans that had gone to Korea and come back. You had veterans that had gone to Vietnam and come back. So these people had gone off into other nations to fight other wars, and don't be fooled by, again, the movies and the stories of people who don't know any better to tell you that black folks only had subservient roles during those wars. World War II, there were fighters in Europe, there were fighters in Asia, there were fighters in Africa, black people fighting battles. They weren't serving, they weren't waiting on tables or any of that. They were actually the warriors in those wars. Come on now. This is where logic needs to kick in. We need to go back to World War. Go back to the Civil War. Black folks fought in the Civil War. We know that. Let's go to the Spanish-American War. Some of Teddy Roosevelt's greatest fighters of the Rough Riders were Buffalo soldiers that had fought in the Indian. We know that. They were the Rough Riders. They were the Buffalo soldiers. And we know in World War I, black folks fought. A lot of them went to Europe, fought on the side of France. Everyone that knows history knows the sacrifices of black folks fighting in war. So do you really think that we would have a World War II, knowing good and well that black folks fought and died in every war that we've had prior to World War II, but they weren't going to fight in World War II because we didn't think they could handle it or they could stand up to the task? Come on now. Does that make any sense? Now tell me if you think this makes more sense. The difference between World War II and World War I and the Spanish-American War and the Civil War and all that the black folks fought in was that now they were making newsreels, they were making movies, and they were sending these black and white video footages back home to the United States of what was going on during the war. Now, what was going on in the United States at the time of World War II? They were still having racism, segregation, oppression, lynchings. All that stuff was going on in the United States. How is the United States going to handle this black and white reel footage showing these black folks that are actually fighting these battles during World War II in Europe, in Africa, and in Asia? There'd be some explaining to do. So that's what you have. It wasn't that the black folks weren't fighting. Look, we had the Red Tails. Now, we all know the stories of the Red Tails, right? The Red Tails were those guys, those flyers, those pilots that would protect our bombers, because our bombers were being shot down before they would hit their targets. So they decided to try out the Red Tails. These black folks, they had the back ends of their airplanes painted red. They would escort these bombers, and guess what? They never lost a bomber. Even to the point where the bomber pilots were saying they would not fly unless they were being escorted by the Red Tails. Well, guess what? During all these escorted bombing missions, these bomber pilots did not know that the Red Tails were black pilots. They didn't know. You know how they found out? One of the bomber pilots parachuted out over Italy. And guess who picked them up? Some black folks. took them back to their base. That's where the Red Tails were based. They were based in Italy. When these white bomber crew recognized the color of the skin of these pilots, that's how it all got out. So the point I'm making is they kept these bomber escorts, the Red Tails, the most successful escorts in their history, a secret. They didn't tell them they were black pilots. So what I'm suggesting is all of the black fighters all throughout World War II, throughout Europe, throughout Africa, throughout Asia, they were a secret. Now, they weren't a secret to the folks they were fighting with, but they were a secret to the American public. Man, I met this guy when I was carrying mail in Dayton. And he was an old guy. I love talking to old folks. I've spoken to quite a few old military men who are actually in war, okay, fighting in World War II. Okay, but this one particular guy, I don't remember how old he was. I think he was in his 80s. I don't know how old he was, but he was old. And we were talking, and he was beginning to tell me, he said, you know why when you see those newsreel footages? He said, why you don't see any black people in any of those footages? And I said, no, why? At the time, I didn't know. He said, we were there. We were there right next to the white boys. He said, but they would refuse to film us. They wouldn't film us. And as he was telling me the story, he began to weep. I mean, he wasn't just shedding a tear. This old man began weeping. And it hurt him so bad. So I'm expressing to you that what we, so I'm giving you the reality that throughout the wars from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, we had black folks actually in battle, in warfare. We had black people that are trained in strategy, black people trained in ordinances, in explosives, in weapons. From World War II, the same thing in Korea, the battle, its strategies, in explosions, in weapons. Vietnam, the same thing, strategy, explosives, weapons. This is what the United States would have been facing had there been a war, a race war, a war between black folks and this government. And so, well, you know, that would have been easily handled. That's what this brother was saying. But you got to recognize at the same time, Fidel Castro had just defeated the Batista government, the corrupt government in his own country, Cuba, showing that a people can overcome. Now, a little bit of history on Cuba. Batista. Who was Batista? Batista had been a sergeant in the Cuban army. And he had been, he was what they call a puppet leader installed by the United States government. So you had the United States, John F. Kennedy, the mafia, Meyer Lansky, running Cuba with their roulette wheels, with their gambling, with their clubs and nightclubs and nightlife. They were running Cuba, making all that money. They were pimping the Cuban people. People were poor, people were suffering. And Fidel had had enough. Many of them had had enough. And Fidel Castro could have continued. Fidel Castro was an attorney. He could have maintained a middle-class lifestyle in Cuba as an attorney, which would have been good. But he couldn't. He had to stand up for his people. Now I know you hear a lot of rhetoric and a lot of people complaining about the Castro regime. A lot of people whose families fled Cuba when Castro took over. But recognize, why do you think they fled Cuba? You had Cuba that was suffering terribly economically. The people were being poor. The people were being pimped by the United States government, by Meyer Lansky, the mob. So why would these people flee? Because these people were the ones benefiting from that particular Batista government. These were the people that were making money. These were the wealthy people, the people that were doing well. Those are the ones that fled. Now come on now. Some of my favorite singers, some of my favorite actors are the children of those Cubans that fled Cuba. But at that time, they weren't fleeing. The only reason they were fleeing Cuba is because they were part of the problem. They were part of the wealthy, the elite in Cuba, that had no concern or no empathy or no consideration for the masses of suffering people in Cuba. That's that. And then you want to say, well, look at the Cubans now. Look how jacked up they are. Look at this. Look at that. Well, a couple things. One thing is they have some of the best doctors. They have free health care. But as far as the issues they have, because they waged an embargo on them. We choked them. We strangled them. You're going to be communist, Fidel Castro. We're going to cut you off. And that's why they've suffered as they have. And then you want to talk about, well, what about the people they throw in their prisons? Terrible prisons, political prisoners and all that. Well, a lot of those political prisoners were working with, like, our government to try to overthrow that government. What would you do? What do we do? What does every nation do? Okay? So I'm just saying is that this is what the United States was facing. Not only these brothers that were fed up, that were coming back from World War II with training and tactical training and weapons and ordinances from World War II, from Korea, from Vietnam. You also had Fidel Castro as an influence, as a model over there. And some of these black folks were watching what was going on there, and you better believe the United States government was watching what was going on over there and recognizing, gosh, we're mistreating these people. What if these people came back? And I guarantee you, if there would have been some kind of issue here at that time, Russia would have found a way to come in with our... Fidel Castro, when he would come to speak at the UN, he would stop in Harlem. And either Google Fidel Castro and Malcolm X. And you can see pictures of them meeting having their own little meetings at the Hotel Teresa, in Harlem. So what you had the United States looking at was these rough brothers in the United States. The United States knew that they were mistreating black people in this country terribly. We had black people that had been coming back from wars, from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, trained. And now you had this example, not too far off our shores, of Fidel Castro defeating the puppet government that we had set up in there through civil war. And not only that, Fidel was also doing? Also going into Africa. And he was aiding the African nations to throw out their European colonizers. So there was a lot of mess going on. You ever heard of a guy named Patrice Lumumba? Google him, Patrice Lumumba. From the Congo. All the black people got together, voted Patrice in to be president. Man, you utilize all those votes, and you have power. And so what happened to him? Belgium, with information from our CIA, assassinated Patrice Lumumba. So there was a lot of fear going on. There was a lot of fear in the United States over not simply Malcolm, Stokely, and all these other brothers, the influence of Fidel Castro to the veterans that have fought in the name of this country in other nations to free people. And then couple that with this peaceful guy, Martin Luther King Jr., that could take a punch. I think LBJ would rather seem to, introduce a civil rights bill, voting rights bill, and all this stuff, than to have to deal with a real insurrection, a real civil war. And with the help of so many nations that don't like our country, the black folks probably would have won. Our nation knew this, dealt with Brother Mar. So I expressed this. To this guy. Man, our nation just wasn't, they weren't just not worried about Malcolm X because, black folks would have just been wiped out. Black folks probably would have won. Look, when I was in high school in the 70s, I had white teachers expressing to me to remember how cool they were in case there was a revolution, that they wouldn't have to suffer. This is real talk. I'm telling you, this is the way it was.